Slapping a military officer across the face in a crowded trauma ward is a fast track to federal prison. But when billionaires think they own every room they walk into, rules vanish. One entitled mother made the worst mistake imaginable, completely unaware her own son was waiting to destroy her perfect world. Fluorescent lights buzzed with a low, relentless hum inside the intensive care unit of Bethesda National Military Medical Center. Lieutenant Abigail Preston adjusted the IV drip for the patient in bed 4, her movements precise and practiced. She had spent 7 years as a Navy trauma nurse, navigating the chaotic aftermath of overseas deployments, stabilizing shattered limbs, and holding the hands of young men and women who woke up screaming from nightmares she could only guess at. She was accustomed to high-stress environments, but nothing could have prepared her for the sheer force of civilian entitlement that was about to breach her ward. Captain Connor Evans lay unconscious beneath the stark white hospital blankets. He was a Marine Force reconnaissance officer who had taken the brunt of an improvised explosive device while pulling 2 of his squad mates from a burning transport vehicle. His medical chart read like a horror story: severe cranial trauma, multiple compound fractures in his lower extremities, and internal lacerations that had taken surgeons 12 hours to repair. Despite the severe injuries, Connor's vitals were finally stabilizing. He was a fighter. Abigail had sat by his bedside through the darkest hours of the night, monitoring his erratic heart rate, quietly urging him to pull through. Chaos erupted at the ICU double doors precisely at 10 in the morning. Security protocols at Bethesda were notoriously strict, requiring clearance, identification, and a mandatory briefing for family members visiting critical patients. Blondie and Richard Evans cared nothing for protocols. Blondie Evans moved through the sterile hallway like a localized hurricane. She wore a tailored Chanel suit that cost more than Abigail's annual salary, her heels clicking aggressively against the linoleum floor. Her husband, Richard, trailed half a step behind, loudly barking into a sleek smartphone about liquidating hedge fund assets. They were old money, East Coast aristocrats, who practically owned half of Manhattan's commercial real estate and held senators on speed dial. "Excuse me, you cannot just barge in here," a young petty officer said, stepping in front of the Evans matriarch. Blondie did not even break her stride. She merely waved a manicured hand as if swatting away an annoying insect. "Move aside, young man. I am here to see my son, and I am not waiting for some bureaucratic paperwork to be filed." Abigail stepped out of Connor's room, closing the glass door firmly behind her. She stood her ground in the center of the hallway, crossing her arms over her blue scrubs. "Ma'am, I am Lieutenant Preston, the charge nurse for this unit. You need to lower your voice immediately. This is a critical care ward." Blondie stopped, looking Abigail up and down, with eyes that mirrored shards of glacial ice. "You must be the help. Where is the chief of medicine? I demand to speak to whoever is in charge of this facility. My son is Captain Connor Evans, and he will be transferred to a private suite immediately." "Captain Evans is in critical condition and cannot be moved," Abigail replied, her voice remaining perfectly level. "He is receiving the highest standard of trauma care available in the country. Furthermore, this is a military hospital. We do not have private VIP suites for purchase." Richard ended his phone call and stepped forward, pulling a gold-plated pen from his breast pocket as if preparing to write a check. "Listen, Lieutenant, we appreciate what your people have done. Really, we do. But my son is heir to the Evans enterprise. We have our own concierge medical team flying in from Johns Hopkins right now. We are moving him to Mount Sinai. Sir, your son suffered a traumatic brain injury and massive internal trauma," Abigail explained, maintaining her professional composure despite the rising heat in her chest. "Moving him via helicopter or ambulance right now would likely induce a fatal hemorrhage. The military surgeons here saved his life. He stays here until he is medically cleared." Blondie scoffed loudly, an ugly sound in the quiet ward. "Saved his life? Look at this place. It smells like bleach and desperation. Connor is a Evans. He never should have joined this ridiculous military charade in the first place. It was a phase, a childish rebellion. And now look what your war has done to my beautiful boy." The sheer disrespect hung heavy in the air. Abigail thought of the men and women she had treated, heroes who had given everything for their country, only to have their sacrifices dismissed as a ridiculous charade by a woman who had likely never faced a genuine hardship in her entire life. "Ma'am, You are welcome to visit your son, Abigail said, her tone leaving zero room for negotiation. But you will adhere to the visiting hours, you will wash your hands before entering his room, and you will not interfere with his medical equipment. If you cannot follow these rules, military police will escort you off the premises. Blondie's jaw tightened. A dangerous flush crept up her neck. She was clearly a woman who had never been told no in her 6 decades of life. She leaned in close to Abigail, her expensive perfume clashing sickeningly with the clinical scent of the hospital. Listen to me very carefully, little nurse, Blondie hissed. I play golf with the Secretary of Defense. I can make one phone call and have you stripped of your rank and scrubbing bedpans in a veterans clinic in Alaska. Do not test me. Abigail did not flinch. Scrubbing bedpans for veterans is an honor, Mrs. Evans. Now, there is the sink. Wash your hands. For the next 4 days, the Evans family turned the ICU into their personal battleground. They complained about the lighting, the food, the nurses, and the doctors. They repeatedly tried to sneak outside specialists into the ward, forcing Abigail to constantly run interference. Throughout it all, Connor remained unresponsive, his body fighting a silent war for survival. Abigail found herself spending her breaks in his room, reading his charts, and sometimes just talking to him softly, hoping a familiar, calm voice would reach him through the darkness. She noticed small things about him, the faint scar on his chin, the way his hands were calloused from years of gripping a rifle and climbing ropes. He was a world away from his arrogant parents. By the 5th day, the tension in the ward had reached a boiling point. Connor had shown slight signs of improvement, a twitch of the fingers, a slight change in his neurological responses, but he was still heavily medicated and dependent on the ventilator. At precisely noon, Blondie Evans arrived with an entourage. Beside her and Richard stood 2 men in expensive suits holding leather briefcases and a civilian doctor wearing a smug expression. Abigail intercepted them at the security checkpoint just outside the ICU double doors. 2 military police officers stood nearby, already looking uneasy at the sight of the wealthy family. "Mrs. Evans, what is this?" Abigail asked, stepping squarely into the center of the corridor. "We are transferring Connor," Blondie announced loudly, holding up a stack of legal documents. "These are my attorneys, and this is Dr. Eris Thorne. Excuse me, Dr. Eris Sterling. No, Dr. Eris Montgomery. He is the top neurosurgeon in the private sector. We have an injunction signed by a federal judge demanding Connor's immediate release into our custody." Abigail didn't even look at the papers. She looked at the civilian doctor. "Dr. Montgomery, if you have reviewed Captain Evans's chart, you know that moving him right now risks an intracranial pressure spike. He is not stable for transport." Dr. Montgomery cleared his throat, looking slightly intimidated by the severe military environment. "Well, Mrs. Evans has secured a pressurized medical transport jet. We believe the risks are manageable given the superior care he will receive at our private facility." "Manageable risks?" Abigail's voice cracked like a whip. "He is an active-duty Marine. He belongs to the United States government, not a private trust fund. Federal injunction or not, the chief medical officer of this base has to approve the transfer, and he has already denied it twice this morning." Richard Evans stepped forward, his face red with fury. "We are his parents. We have power of attorney. We make the medical decisions when he is incapacitated, not some glorified military high school nurse. Until he is discharged from service, the military dictates his care, while in a critical status resulting from combat operations," Abigail stated firmly. "You are not taking him." Blondie pushed past her husband, her face contorted with unadulterated rage. "I am sick of you. From the moment I walked into this filthy hospital, you have been nothing but a roadblock. You are a low-class, arrogant little girl playing soldier, and I will not let you murder my son out of sheer bureaucratic spite." "Mrs. Evans, step back," Abigail warned, raising a hand to create physical distance. "Do not tell me what to do," Blondie shrieked. Without warning, Blondie raised her hand and swung. The slap echoed through the quiet corridor like a gunshot. The force of the blow snapped Abigail's head to the side, knocking her crisp white cap askew. A sharp sting radiated across her cheek, rapidly blooming into a burning red handprint. For a single, agonizing second, the entire ward froze. Nurses at the charting station dropped their pens. The two military police officers immediately unclipped their radios, stepping forward with their hands resting defensively on their utility belts. Assaulting a commissioned officer of the United States Armed Forces was a federal offense, and Blondie Evans had just committed it in front of a dozen witnesses. Abigail slowly turned her head back to face Blondie. She did not raise her hand to her cheek. She did not shout. Her eyes were stone cold. "Ma'am," Abigail said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, terrifying whisper. "You just made a terrible mistake." "Arrest her!" Richard yelled, pointing at Abigail as if trying to reverse the reality of what just happened. "She threatened my wife. She was blocking our legal right to our son." "Detain them both," Abigail commanded the MPs, her authority ringing clear. As the military police moved in, grabbing Richard's arms and stepping toward a suddenly pale Blondie, a sharp, ragged sound cut through the commotion. It wasn't a shout. It was the frantic, rhythmic beeping of an alarm from room 4. Connor's room. Abigail spun around, abandoning the Evans, and sprinted toward the glass doors. She burst into the room, expecting to see his vitals crashing. Instead, she stopped dead in her tracks. Captain Connor Evans's eyes were open. They were bloodshot and unfocused, but they were open. His chest heaved as his hand, trembling violently, reached up and grabbed the plastic tubing of his ventilator. Before Abigail could stop him, he yanked the breathing tube free, triggering a chaotic symphony of medical alarms. "Connor, stop!" Abigail rushed to the bedside, instantly silencing the alarms and grabbing an oxygen mask to place over his mouth. Outside the glass, Blondie had managed to shove past the hesitating MPs. She burst into the room, her previous anger replaced by frantic desperation. "Connor! Oh, my baby! Connor! Mommy is here! We're getting you out of this awful place. We're taking you home." She reached out to grab his hand, completely ignoring the sterile field and Abigail's presence. Connor's chest hitched as he struggled to pull air into his traumatized lungs. His eyes, previously clouded with medication and pain, suddenly snapped into sharp, crystalline focus. He looked at the woman who had just assaulted the charge nurse. He looked at the chaos she had dragged into his room. He saw the red handprint burning brightly across Abigail's cheek. He didn't look at his mother with love. He looked at her with absolute disgust. Connor weakly pushed Blondie's hand away. He took a ragged breath through the oxygen mask, reached up with a shaking hand, and pulled the plastic away from his mouth just enough to speak. His voice was raw, sounding like gravel crushed under heavy tires, but it carried an undeniable authority that instantly silenced the room. "Get this woman out of my sight," Connor rasped, locking eyes with the military police officers standing in the doorway. "Arrest her. She isn't just a threat to my commanding officer." He turned his head slowly, his gaze softening, as he looked up at the nurse who had spent 5 sleepless nights guarding his life. "She just assaulted my wife." Blondie Evans's pristine, surgically enhanced face drained of all color. The declaration hung in the sterile air of the intensive care unit, a heavy, suffocating truth that immediately shattered the billionaire's carefully constructed reality. Blondie stumbled backward, her expensive Chanel heels suddenly unstable beneath her trembling frame. She looked from the battered, broken form of her son to the charge nurse standing beside his bed, the red welt still glowing fiercely on Abigail's cheek. "Wife?" Blondie gasped, the word tearing from her throat like a physical injury. "Connor, darling, you are delirious. The medication, the trauma to your brain. You don't know what you are saying. You aren't married to this hospital worker." "I am completely lucid," Connor whispered, his voice trembling with exertion. Every word clearly cost him immense physical effort, but the steel in his eyes never wavered. "Abigail and I were married 6 months ago in Virginia. I intentionally left you off the notification roster. Now, get out of my room before I press federal charges for what you just did to her." Richard Evans stepped forward, his bluster temporarily returning. "This is a farce, a clear manipulation by a woman trying to dig her claws into the Evans estate. Dr. Montgomery, tell these guards that my son is suffering from acute delirium. Lawyers, present the power of attorney." The 2 high-priced attorneys scrambled to open their briefcases, brandishing thick stacks of legal documents with wax seals and notarized signatures. But Dr. Montgomery, the civilian neurosurgeon they had brought to force the transfer, was already backing away toward the door. He was a man who understood liability, and he was currently standing in a federal military installation while a billionaire's wife assaulted a commissioned officer. "Mr. Evans, I cannot medically declare him delirious," Dr. Montgomery stammered, raising his hands in surrender. "He is tracking visually, responding to stimuli, and forming coherent sentences. And frankly, I want no part of whatever this is." "Sir, ma'am, put your hands behind your backs," the senior military police officer ordered, stepping firmly between the Evans and the hospital bed. He pulled a pair of heavy tactical flex cuffs from his belt. "You cannot arrest me!" Blondie shrieked, her aristocratic composure completely disintegrating into a hysterical frenzy. "Do you know who I am? We fund senators. We own half of Manhattan. I will have this entire hospital bulldozed and turned into a parking lot." "You are on a federal military installation, Mrs. Evans," the MP replied coldly, grabbing her wrist and twisting it behind her back with practiced, unyielding efficiency. "Your money means absolutely nothing here. You are under arrest for the assault of a commissioned naval officer." As the MPs physically restrained a thrashing, screaming Blondie, Abigail turned her attention entirely back to her patient, her husband. The professional boundary she had maintained for 5 agonizing days dissolved, but her medical training remained razor-sharp. Connor's heart rate monitor was spiking dangerously, the alarms resuming their frantic warning. By pulling his own ventilator tube, he had compromised his already fragile respiratory system. "Connor, look at me," Abigail commanded, her voice softening into a tone of profound, desperate love, though her hands moved with rapid precision. She secured a high-flow oxygen mask over his nose and mouth. "You need to calm down. Your heart rate is at 140. Breathe with me. In through the nose, out through the mouth." Connor reached up, his battered, scarred hand wrapping weakly around her wrist. His thumb brushed against the edge of the red mark on her face. A tear slipped from the corner of his eye, carving a clean path through the bruises on his face. "I'm sorry," he rasped through the plastic mask. "I'm so sorry she touched you." "I don't care about that. I only care about you," Abigail whispered back, pressing her forehead gently against his for a fleeting second before stepping back to adjust his IV drip. "You have to rest, Marine. You gave them hell, but now you need to let your body heal. I've got the watch." Outside the glass doors, the chaos was reaching its peak. Colonel Thomas Harrison, the base commander, had arrived on the floor, flanked by a squad of security personnel. Richard Evans was screaming obscenities, waving his useless power of attorney documents in the commander's face. Colonel Harrison took the documents, barely glanced at them, and handed them back. "Mr. Evans, these documents are entirely superseded. Military protocol and federal law are exceedingly clear. In the event of incapacitation, medical proxy defaults to the legal spouse. Lieutenant Preston is listed in Captain Evans's official military personnel file as his lawful wife. She is his designated next of kin, and she holds full power of attorney." Richard stared at the base commander, his jaw slack, the realization finally crashing down upon him. The billions of dollars sitting in offshore accounts, the political connections, the ruthless corporate maneuvering, none of it could penetrate the titanium walls of the military bureaucracy defending his son. The secret Abigail and Connor had guarded so fiercely had finally served its purpose. They had met 3 years prior, during a joint training exercise in Coronado. Connor was drawn to her fierce independence and quiet strength. Abigail was captivated by the surprising gentleness hiding behind his lethal Marine recon exterior. When things became serious, Connor revealed the dark reality of his lineage. The Evans family did not welcome outsiders. They destroyed them. Blondie was notorious for hiring private investigators to ruin the careers and reputations of anyone she deemed unworthy of the Evans name. When Connor received his deployment orders to a highly volatile combat zone, they knew they couldn't wait. They drove to a tiny, rain-soaked courthouse in Virginia and swore their vows with no family present, trading cheap titanium bands they kept hidden on dog-tag chains beneath their uniforms. Connor had updated his official military records, but swore the administrative clerks to secrecy. He knew that if he was injured or killed, he wanted Abigail to be the one making the decisions, not the parents who had treated his life like a corporate asset. The removal of Blondie and Richard Evans from the ICU felt like the exorcism of a toxic presence. As the heavy double doors swung shut behind the struggling billionaires, a profound, heavy silence settled over the trauma ward. Blondie Evans was not given the luxury of a private escort. She was marched through the busy main lobby of the Bethesda Medical Center in plastic zip ties, mascara running down her face in dark, jagged streams. Doctors, nurses, and wounded veterans watched in stunned silence as the matriarch of the Evans Empire was loaded into the back of a military police cruiser. The federal charge of assaulting a commissioned officer carried a mandatory court appearance and potential prison time. No amount of high-priced legal maneuvering could erase the fact that she had struck an active-duty officer in front of a dozen credible military witnesses. Back in the quiet sanctuary of Room 4, Abigail finally allowed her professional armor to crack. She locked the door, pulled the privacy blinds shut, and collapsed into the hard plastic chair beside Connor's bed. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as 5 days of suppressed terror, exhaustion, and adrenaline finally broke over her. She felt a weak, trembling pressure on her knee. Abigail lifted her head. Connor had shifted his hand to rest against her leg. His breathing was stabilized through the oxygen mask, his eyes heavy with the powerful sedatives coursing through his veins. But he was fighting the medication to stay awake for her. "You didn't have to break your cover," Abigail whispered, wiping her tears with the back of her sleeve. "You could have compromised your recovery by yanking that tube." "You scared me to death, Connor." "She hit my wife," Connor replied slowly, the gravel in his voice accompanied by a fierce, undeniable protectiveness. "I promised, in that courthouse, I would protect you from them. Even if I was half dead, I wasn't going to let them treat you like that." Abigail stood up, leaning over the bed, being careful to avoid the myriad of wires and tubes keeping him alive. She gently cupped the uninjured side of his face. "We protected each other, but they know now. The secret is out. Your parents are going to unleash hell when they get their lawyers involved." Connor offered a weak, lopsided smile, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his facial stitches. "Let them try. I belong to the Corps, and I belong to you. They have no jurisdiction here." Over the next 3 weeks, the Evans family attempted to wage a war of attrition against the military medical system. Richard hired a team of aggressive civil rights attorneys, attempting to claim that Connor's marriage was fraudulent and performed under duress. They filed motions, leaked fabricated stories to the tabloids, and even attempted to pressure Pentagon officials into overriding Colonel Harrison's authority. It was a spectacular failure. The military closed ranks around its own. The base JAG officers systematically dismantled every legal threat Richard Evans presented. The marriage certificate was ironclad. Connor's psychological evaluations from before his deployment proved he was of sound mind when he signed the paperwork assigning Abigail as his medical proxy. Furthermore, Blondie Evans's legal troubles became a media spectacle. Security footage of her slapping a Navy nurse in the ICU was leaked to a major news network. The public backlash was swift and merciless. The Evans enterprise saw its stock prices plummet as investors scrambled to distance themselves from a woman who had assaulted a military officer caring for wounded veterans. To avoid federal prison, Blondie was forced to accept a humiliating plea deal that included extensive community service, a massive fine, and a permanent ban from entering any military installation in the United States. Inside the hospital, entirely insulated from the media circus outside, Connor slowly rebuilt his strength. The road to recovery was brutal. There were days of agonizing physical therapy, moments of deep, dark frustration when his shattered legs refused to support his weight, and nights filled with the terrible echoes of the explosion that had nearly taken his life. But he never fought alone. Abigail stepped down from her position as charge nurse to become his dedicated caregiver, balancing her deep medical expertise with the boundless patience of a devoted wife. When Connor struggled, she pushed him. When he despaired, she grounded him. She was his anchor in the stormy sea of trauma recovery. 6 months after the incident in the ICU, Captain Connor Evans walked out of the Bethesda National Military Medical Center. He leaned heavily on a polished wooden cane, a slight limp permanently altering his once perfect stride, but his head was held high. He wore his dress blues, the medals on his chest catching the bright afternoon sunlight. Abigail walked right beside him, her arm looped firmly through his. She was out of her scrubs, wearing a simple, elegant civilian dress. Her own military service temporarily paused as they prepared to transition into the next chapter of their lives together. A sleek black town car was waiting at the curb, sent by Richard Evans in one final, desperate attempt to bridge the canyon he and his wife had created. The driver stood nervously by the open door, holding a thick envelope bearing the Evans corporate seal. Connor stopped. He looked at the car, then looked at the envelope. For a moment, the weight of his old life, the billions of dollars, the legacy, the overwhelming pressure hung in the air between them. Connor didn't say a word. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, heavy silver coin, his Marine Recon Challenge coin, and handed it to the driver. "Tell my father I paid my debts," Connor said quietly, his voice carrying the calm, unshakable authority of a man who had faced death and survived. "Tell him the Evans have one less heir, and the world has one more Marine. We are done here." He turned away from the town car and gestured to a battered, reliable Jeep parked a few spots away. Abigail smiled, unlocking the vehicle and helping him into the passenger seat. As she climbed behind the wheel and started the engine, she looked over at the man she loved. The scars on his face were healing. The titanium in his legs held him steady. The empire of wealth and arrogance that had tried to tear them apart had been reduced to ashes in their rearview mirror. "Where to, Captain?" Abigail asked, shifting the Jeep into drive. Connor reached across the center console, intertwining his calloused fingers with hers. He looked at the simple titanium band resting on her ring finger, a symbol far more valuable than anything his family's money could ever buy. "Take us home, Lieutenant," Connor smiled. "Take us home." Did this gripping story of love, entitlement, and justice keep you on the edge of your seat? Sometimes, the most powerful armor a soldier has is the person waiting for them at home. If you loved seeing this arrogant billionaire family face a heavy dose of reality, hit that like button. Share this video with your friends who love military drama, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life stories every single week.
Hi, my name is Tran Tan, the owner and manager of Noble Tales. After watching the video, a wealthy family slapped the military nurse, then their injured Marine son spoke one sentence. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? For me, this story was a reminder that respect and compassion matter, especially when emotions are running high. It's easy to make assumptions in difficult moments, but taking the time to understand someone can change everything. Which moment had the biggest impact on you? Do you think one act of honesty can change the way people see each other? If this story gave you something to think about, maybe carry a little more patience and empathy into your own conversations. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this story, feel free to like or subscribe for more from Noble Tales.